India has a rich maritime heritage spanning over 4,000 years. Historically, its maritime engagements have impacted the society and culture of India. Over the last decades, the strategists have realized the need to revitalize the neglected maritime identity of India. Warm greetings and welcome to a brand new episode of C3S interview. Today's topic of discussion is India's maritime identity and diplomacy. For the discussions, we have with us Mr. Rishi Athreya, Head of Research, Strategic Studies, Head of Corporate Relations, Indus International Research Foundation. He is also a distinguished member of C3S, an alumnus of Flinders University, Adelaide, and University of Leeds, wherein he acquired advanced degrees in international relations and development studies. Mr. Rishi Athreya is a public sector and political risk consultant. Mr. Rishi Athreya is a widely published author and has written on various topics related to governance, security, and diplomacy. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time from your busy schedule.
Thank you, Sapna.
Without any further delay, we'll be moving on to the questions. So the first question I would like to ask you is regarding the Indian coastal security. So India's coastline spans a distance of 7,516.6 kilometers. And India has grown to recognize the significance of safeguarding its wide coastline over the years. The coastal region of India is also subject to a number of conventional and unconventional threats. In this regard, could you please touch upon the challenges India faces and the growing need for enhanced coastal security?
Well, India, one could say, is basically a maritime country. It's located bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And the India's main interests regarding maritime are for our energy because it imports its oil through the sea. And other issues are trade. And then India also has a large fishery sector. India has a large 12 to 13% of global seafarers are Indian. Then India, besides that, also has a number of overseas citizens of India and non-resident Indians who also are overseas, which adds to India's maritime interests. And of course, the more important, the other thing which India faces, like any other country, India faces what can be called threats which are in, through, or from sea, to borrow Vice Admiral Chauhan's classification. And one could say some of these threats are essentially man-made, and regarding traditional threats are essentially threats from other countries, other nation states. And the best example in India's case is China and increasingly Pakistan, which is developing maritime capability. And secondly, there's a larger global geopolitical situation. And the non-traditional threats are also, which could include transnational crime, terrorism, piracy, illegal and unreported fishing. And what's to be noted in India's case is, even in these non-traditional threats, which is best illustrated by 2611, there has actually been the involvement of a nation state. And some of these, and besides these, India, of course, has the risk of cyclones and tsunamis and natural phenomenon, and climate, which is essentially natural. Then there's climate change, which is a combination of nature and man-made human action, which has caused climate change. So these are India's basic maritime challenges, and keeping sea lanes of communication and international lines of shipping open and freedom of navigation is key to India's maritime security. And the other thing to note here, one of India's underlying problems is India has had an essentially continentalist mindset. So the continental borders with China or with Pakistan have always been given more importance than maritime security. And this has been noted since even before independence. Of course, India didn't have a navy till the Second World War. The Royal Indian Navy continued even after independence. It became the Indian Navy, and it continued to be staffed by British officers for a few years after, till about the late 1950s. So India essentially has not been a maritime nation at all. So that is and regarding maritime security, One can see even in the past, it's said that even during the 1965 and 71 wars, the Navy played a role, which is quite often underrated. And besides, the global scenario has always had a maritime aspect. India has maritime territories in Lakshadweep and Andaman Nicobar Islands, both of which have suffered neglect. And thanks to Andaman Nicobar Islands, India actually is in the neighborhood of most of ASEAN countries, including Indonesia. And India is quite close to the Strait of Malacca, which is one of the major choke points, which India could control. So this, and even to the west, India's whole dealings with the Gulf states, Persian Gulf states, Middle East. Essentially, India imports oil, and that oil comes through the sea. So that is India's maritime interest. And one major threat which one can realize by 2611 is India faces amphibious threats, because an innocuous looking boat, which could either have been just a fishing boat, would even have been taken for a commercial fishing vessel, not only attacked India's coastline, actually brought terrorists who finally attacked land. So that it became whether it was the duty of the Navy. The Navy couldn't have stopped them because they were not enemy combatant. The Coast Guard could have stopped them in its constabulary role, or the coastal police in the state of Maharashtra should have stopped them. But once they came on land, you had to call it army commandos. It became land warfare. So basically, that was an amphibious attack. So effectively, unless India gives importance to maritime security and at all levels, traditional threats, non-traditional threats, economic aspects, it continues to be neglected in India. And given and so effectively, you're sitting in Chennai, and most of India is peninsular. And peninsular India has got a number of major ports, and 95% through volume and 75% through value of India's trade is through the sea. So, to summarize, India has a number of maritime challenges and interests, and it has to move from a continentalist to a maritime mindset to take this further. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now moving on to the diplomacy part of India's maritime identity. The shifting trends in the Indo-Pacific have both directly and indirectly affected India's maritime posture. Multilateral organizations have sprouted in the region as a result of the rising Chinese aggression and influence, be it the Quad, AUKUS, IONS, or the IORA. So, how do you assess the multilateral groupings' effectiveness in addressing these regional challenges faced by these countries, and considering that it performs a major influence in the Asian strategic architecture in the present scenario?
Well, if you talk about organizations and groupings, some distinction has to be made. Quad essentially is a grouping of four countries. It's not an official organization which has its own secretariat. It cannot be compared to ASEAN secretariat, in which you talk of the Indo-Pacific, or the United Nations, or the Commonwealth secretariat for that matter. A large part of the Indo-Pacific is Commonwealth. And so Quad is just a grouping. AUKUS itself is only a grouping. IONS is a symposium which is more like a meeting forum. IORA could be called the closest to an international organization for the Indo-Pacific. Now, to take any one of these, IORA has had more role in the benign sphere, that is of climate change, fishing, and maybe a degree of constabulary role. But IORA has not worked as a military alliance. The membership is quite broad-based. So it's really difficult for IORA and IORA has not got into rule making or conventions. So possibly one can say IORA has not been very effective. And the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, I think, was only held in 2022, and both of these organizations or groups, if you like, were affected by the pandemic. Now, coming to the other grouping is talking of Quad. Now, Quad essentially started out as a HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Grouping, after the 2004 tsunami. Later on, there's been talk about the diamond or the confluence of seas, Shinzo Abe's famous speech, but some people say the Quad never took off around 2007 to 12. Then it's taken off again in the past few years. But the Quad again, it's called it, the word Quad has only been used in the past 2 to 3 years in ministerial declarations. The first country to use the word Quad was the US, United States. If you look at the four members, US, Australia, India, and Japan, each of these countries have their own interests. So the Quad, they do hold joint naval exercises like exercise Malabar includes all the Quad members. But the Quad itself has also moved more towards um, uh, non-traditional and benign spheres such as vaccine, supply chain, climate change. But one good thing with the Quad is the latest meeting of the Quad foreign ministers meet going beyond, of course, talked about 26/11, which is very important from India's point of view, and also mentioned the Pathankot terror strikes. Effectively, Quad is willing to, even if not actively, is at least willing to acknowledge India's concerns as far as terrorism and non-traditional security and state-sponsored terrorism, non-traditional security threats are concerned. On the issue of AUKUS, AUKUS as the name, as is evident in the name, is Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. Now, this grouping came together of three countries basically to transfer nuclear technology to Australia to Australia by the United States and United Kingdom. Now, Australia in the process scrapped an existing deal with France to build nuclear submarines. One may say that given that the Quad has moved away from its military role, AUKUS may provide a deterrent to China. But at the same time, ASEAN countries have legitimate concerns about nuclear proliferation. Now, whether Australia says they're only getting nuclear powered submarines as opposed to having nuclear weapons, it's a debatable point. But there do continue concerns regarding nuclear issue. And another important grouping in the maritime sphere is what can be called the Southern Hemisphere Quad, because what we call the Quad should really be called the Northern Hemisphere Quad. That is Australia is in the Southern Hemisphere, but Japan, India, and US are in the Northern Hemisphere. There is another Quad which consists of Australia, New Zealand, US, and France, and France by virtue of its Pacific territories. France is an Indian Ocean power because of Reunion Island. It's still and it has some Pacific, New Caledonia, and other territories in the Pacific. So possibly one can say the Southern Quad has also been an important grouping. It's also had an important role. So both of the quads are important. So when we talk about and another thing is the UK is getting increasingly active in the Pacific. There have been suggestions for P7 because the two quads together become 6 countries, and if you add UK, that's P7. And an interesting sideline of AUKUS is the admiral who's heading it is Vice Admiral Jonathan Dallas Mead. He did staff college at the National Defense College in New Delhi, which is a staff college where India trains officers who are 1 star and above. There are also foreign delegates, but often the view is that officers from developing countries would go to developed countries for training. But here it's clearly there seems to be a two-way street. So India indirectly can say that it does have an indirect connection to the creation of AUKUS through this admiral, and of course India. So I'd say that regarding groupings, the Quad, Northern Hemisphere Quad or the Southern Hemisphere Quad were never military in nature. AUKUS being military would provide a deterrent to China. And ASEAN centrality means ASEAN really doesn't want to see the entire ASEAN region get militarized. So this is where I'd say that certainly there is a tendency for countries which find China belligerent to create deterrence. But one challenge India has faced is that India has close ties with Russia. Now, India is having to balance its ties with Russia with its ties with the Quad, Northern Quad. So much so that in the latest Vostok exercise, India avoided the maritime component. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We just spoke about the groupings, multilateral groupings. There are a lot of several trilateral agreements, of India with other countries. Very recently, we saw the one with France and UAE, India, France, and UAE. So, which one would you consider as a very significant agreement at this present scenario, and which has the potential to become a vital, which has the potential to play a very vital role in the coming years?
Well, I go on to say that two trilaterals where India and France are together. And I'd first start by saying India and France have always had good military ties. Even in the so called Cold War era, when India was close to the Soviet Union, France has always been India's second largest military supplier. Now, India has also been had cooperation with France regarding Reunion Island, and India provides maritime military and constabulary assistance to Mauritius and Seychelles, both of which are in the vicinity of Reunion Island. So India and France have always, I'll start by saying, had good relations. Now, one trilateral to start from the western side, and because nearer to France's own Indian Ocean territories, I'd say that France, India, UAE, as you mentioned, is a very important trilateral. UAE is one country that has where France has for long had a military presence, and France having a permanent base in Abu Dhabi gives it a control over major choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. And France has also provided air power support to UAE in terms of some of the threats it's facing. And one could hasten to add that this India, along with France and UAE, participated in exercise Desert Flag, and there were six countries: UAE, USA, France, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, apart from India. Jordan, Greece, Qatar, Egypt, and South Korea were observers. So one may say that India, France, UAE has proved to be an important trilateral and will continue to do so. And India is also part of what is called the Middle East Quad. If you want to call it, having talked of the Northern and Southern Quad, you can call this the Middle Eastern Quad. It's not quite Western. Let's call it the Middle Eastern Quad. That's what it's been called. And it includes India, Israel, UAE, and USA. And this is basic. Their focus is more on economics, technology, transportation, clean energy. And France is believed to have provided UAE air power support against Houthi rebels operating from who are attacking UAE, operating from who are backed by Iran. So India and UAE have had long-term maritime ties. So India, France, UAE is one trilateral. Another important trilateral, which is particularly significant in the context of AUKUS, where in some ways there was a fear that Australia had burnt its boats with France, is the India, Australia, France trilateral. Now, given the fact that India and Australia, both as neutral middle powers, have always had good ties, and India, although one can say Australia, by paying compensation to France in monetary terms, has tried to mend fences. The India, France, Australia trilateral that's long been suggested is another very important alliance. Now, one could say that given that it was recently believed that these three countries together are quite important in countering China. And there was a meeting at the official diplomatic level between the three countries. So that's often seen as a watershed in creating a trilateral alliance. And so going further, one doesn't notice that there are several groups like Five Eyes, FDPA in the Indo-Pacific. But one point that gets neglected in the context of Australia, New Zealand, UK wanting to re-enter the Indo-Pacific, the suggestion of P7 is that all of these are Commonwealth countries. UK's presence in the Indo-Pacific or in the Pacific, essentially talking of the Pacific and not the South Pacific, is essentially due to its close ties with New Zealand. The UK effectively depends on New Zealand for its presence in the South Pacific. So, really speaking, trilaterals, of course, one can say that although Australia has a republican movement, to date, Australia and New Zealand continue to be dominions. So, they still have the same head of state. Even were Australia to become a republic, like India is a republic, that may not necessarily dilute people to people and Commonwealth ties between Australia, UK, New Zealand, and where it can certainly go beyond the English language and certain games like cricket. I think this tie is the Commonwealth tie is somewhat underrated in the global sphere. So, as I mentioned, the P7 because UK is also re-entering the Indo-Pacific, and so these are all one can say the main global groupings. But one thing one can say is that Brexit caused UK to also strain its relations with France. Although they are both part of NATO, there is a view that UK has to rebuild its military relations with France. Thanks. So,
Thank you very much, sir. As we have come to the end of a very engaging and informative session, which is very precise, with very precise answers, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our speaker for today, Mr. Rishi Athreya, for taking out time from his busy schedule and engaging with us. Thank you, sir, and we look forward to such enlightening sessions with you.
thank you very much, Sapna, and thanks to C3S for making this interview possible. And thank you.